Welcome back to Mnet School Ties podcast as we continue the conversation about grooming and sexual abuse at some of our most prominent and prestigious schools in South Africa. In studio now, I have Nicole Engelbrecht, who is from True Crime South Africa. I have Gielie Hoffmann, who is a sports psychologist and life coach. And I have Robyn Voster, who's a child protection activist and writer. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole, I want to go in with you because you have this incredible, powerful podcast. And I've always believed that speaking and talking about issues or abuse or whatever it is incredibly vital. Let's talk about the aftermath, and I use aftermath in a positive way, of when people share their stories and what you've encountered.
I think the last 5 years for me have been an incredible understanding and the power of stories for both the listener and the teller. One particular episode that I shared on my podcast, which really left me understanding the power of that, was a man who shared his experience of sexual grooming and abuse in his own childhood. And he had a bit of a situation where the perpetrator, in his case, was female. It was a female offender. And he'd had all sorts of emotions wrapped up around that. Also, the offender was a similar age to him. That had added another layer of confusion. And when this man was brave enough to share his story on the podcast, after that I had this influx of stories and responses from listeners where it had just impacted so many people so deeply. People reflecting on incidents from their own childhood, people reflecting on elements of forgiveness he'd spoken about. And you know, at one point I had to stop looking at my email because it was just too overwhelming. But I would go back and I would start working through the emails again, because people really, they didn't want answers from me. They just wanted to be the one sharing as well.
Wow.
And I really found that so exceptionally powerful.
Yeah. And especially if you look at the culture in society, and particularly at the schools, it's about the culture of secrecy, about keeping it pushing it under the carpet. Let's not taint the so-called school's image. Gielie, let's talk about that culture that exists, particularly within our schools.
Yeah, I think something that Sirius did very well is getting the conversation going again. And some people are only now connecting the dots and seeing the role that a school can play preventative-wise, but also how it did create this environment for the grooming to take place. So I think going forward in terms of also for parents and sports coaches and the environment that I work in is to be constructive and see what can we do in advance. You know, I think there are many things in place that help people once it has taken place. But I think there's lots of work to be done on the preventative side. And culture is how we work, how we live, how things function. And the air of secrecy, Nicole referred to now. And the power, many people think that they are the only ones. And the moment they hear other stories, there's some relief. And some of the shame is lifted actually when they understand, I didn't do something wrong and I'm not the only one who experienced this.
Yeah. Robyn, as a child protection activist and a writer, let's speak to the realities of the different types of stories that are out there that you know, as Gielie said, that people think that, you know, that they're the only ones. And let's talk about, and the reason why I want to talk about this is because of the reality that the crisis that we're in terms of abuse in our country is incredibly high, and that it's not something that can just be brushed over.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think what is absolutely terrifying, if you look at statistics, is that we even have teachers who are teaching in our schools and have been teaching in our schools for long term, who've got criminal records for sexual assault. So this is happening across the board. And what often happens in more impoverished schools is we look at more obvious transactional sexual abuse. So it might be as simple as a teacher comes to a child and says, you need to come to my classroom after school if you'd like to pass maths. It is as horrific as that. And often there's a lot more violence in that form of abuse as well. And so, interesting enough, often we actually are more aware of that kind of abuse. And a lot of people ask the question about school ties is, why does it focus specifically on elite schools? Which is a very important question to ask, because there's no frame of reference in South Africa where we can say that this only happens in elite schools. But what is particularly interesting about the sexual assault of children in elite schools is that it happens in a far more subtle way. We see this process of long-term grooming, of choosing victims very carefully, often elite children, children who've got huge ambitions around success and wanting to go forward wanting to represent their schools, their country even, in their sport. So they have huge currency. And what perpetrators can do in that environment is they use the culture of secrecy, and they carefully break down the way that children feel about themselves. So they elevate them, they make them feel really special and really important. And then they subtly undermine that. Tell them they're not good enough, tell them they need more help, tell them they need to come and get extra coaching. And so the child is on this emotional yo-yo of feeling favorited because this coach thinks I'm amazing and thinks I've got potential and wants to work with me. But at the same time, I'm not good enough and I must do more. And so that child becomes more and more manipulated and emotionally at the mercy of that particular perpetrator. And so what the system does is it allows those children to become victimized in a far more subtle way. And so what we need to look at is we need to look at both the transactional and the violent assault and make sure that that doesn't happen. But we also need to prepare families and victims and schools for that far more subtle abuse, which often goes undetected for years at a time.
If I may add to that, I think the sporting mind is very interesting, because an athlete or a player can have a very specific skill set, something they can do, but that doesn't imply that they are emotionally balanced or socially balanced. So it's actually a very fragile mind in a high pressure environment. So if you get acknowledgement, if you get extra attention, who's not gonna like that? Because it's also an emotional environment where when we win, we share that emotion. When we lose, there's disappointments. And that just opens the door for the predator. A normal person doesn't see that as an opportunity to abuse. But the predator sees it as, I can build slowly over time trust, I can support, I can encourage, I can help them in a sense. And that is where, but I think the bigger thing for me is parents, especially at elite schools, they do outsource education, but also parenting to a certain degree. They say, I pay you a big amount of money each year, and I entrust my child to you. And that is one of the big problems for me, because if you don't maintain a great relationship with your kid, you're not going to pick this up. Absolutely. If you don't know what the details are in terms of the activities, the coaching relationships, how things take place at the school, you're not going to pick this up. And unfortunately, what we saw now in the series is, even though these elite schools have many other things in place, this is not something they have had covered in the past.
Yeah, and perpetrators are very calculating.
Yeah.
So with you mentioning, excuse me, that some people might have been abused by another woman, society has told us that that can never happen. You know, let's talk to the realities of what society has told us that actually are one of the biggest red flags in front of us that we've overlooked. Whether it's perpetuated through misogyny or patriarchy, that we think, well, a woman could never be able to do that, yet we are capable of committing some of those horrific crimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly something that I've found in many of the cases that I've looked at. And specifically here, you know, we teach children stranger danger. And the truth is that really it's those close to us that we know that are the greatest danger to us and to our children. And secondly, that women are safe, and women are perhaps more trustworthy than men. And what we do when we teach children that is, firstly, we close down the opportunity for men to think of themselves as good and as trustworthy. And we offer female offenders or female predators the opportunity to use that and weaponize it to harm children and other vulnerable people. And it often blows my mind how easily we do that. And, I find myself having to, even after all the work I've done over 5 years, having to regularly correct my own thinking around female perpetrators and, just wondering, why am I giving this perpetrator grace based on very simply their gender?
And as I said in the first part of the series, it's about also unlearning some of the traits that we've been taught, from a very, very early age. And one of them is what a perpetrator is supposed to look like. So for me, which I'm not going to mention my age, but going back in those years, we were always told that the perpetrators are the people in the dark alleys, people from the wrong side of the tracks. Meantime, they are the ones that have been hired at the prestigious schools. They could be your neighbor. Let's talk about the reality of what perpetrators can look like and what they do look like.
I think that's very astute because, yes, there is the stereotype of the perpetrator as somebody who is so overtly evil that we could spot them a mile away. And in the conversations that I've had with schools, often they'll say to me, but I know my staff. No, I know them. These are people that I've recruited. I might braai with them. I'll have a drink with them. I know them well. I know their families. I know their children. And yet we don't always know what's going on behind closed doors. So I think that's very important, is it's kind of that process, as you say, of unlearning the idea that actually we can spot predators just by the way that they look. Often predators are incredibly likable people. They're people that people are drawn to. And bear in mind that in order for them to function, they have to do grooming, first of all, of the authorities that recruit them and who they work under. They also groom the parents, and then they groom the children. And so often these are people that you kind of think, oh yeah, I'd love to entrust my child to this person, because they come across as so warm and so lovely and so interested in your child, which, as Luke mentioned earlier, is often one of the keys, is when that person is too interested in your child. But I think we should be looking more at what perpetrators do than necessarily who they are. Because if we can look at the behaviors and we can say, first of all, we need to actually say that sometimes that perpetrator is not going to actually offend, but nonetheless their behavior needs to be dealt with, it needs to be remedied. They either need to not be in a school environment, or alternatively they need to be managed through a disciplinary process so that they behave better. But if they are actually going to be somebody who is going to be an offender, then what we need to do is we need to be able to spot what those telltale signs are, both as a school and as families, so that we can actually say early on in the process, okay, this needs to stop right now. And that is a much more hardy way of identifying perpetrators. And again, as Luke and Dumi said earlier, it's really important that we don't trust our own judgment in this. We actually often need expert help, because if we have been groomed ourselves, maybe we're not going to necessarily pick up what we think we would always know when our child is being hurt, but we don't necessarily always know.
And if you look at the culture particularly with the school ties and with other schools, is that there might have been grooming from the high levels and the parents, but what about the culture with the teachers that might have known?
Yes. I think what Brian said is very valuable. I think we have a very binary way of thinking. So somebody is purely good or purely evil, and it's much more nuanced than that. And when we change our perception, that's where we allow our intuition and what we see actually. So I think fellow teachers and colleagues are actually the people who are on the scene of the crime, so to say, every single day. And these people they have habits, they have patterns, and over time you can see certain things happening. And something that I've picked up now with the conversations with some of the other specialists is, the burden of proof isn't there in the beginning of the conversation. It's just to say, I am a little bit afraid of what I'm seeing. Let's look into that. And if there's nothing, fine. But if there's something, we can pick it up much earlier.
Yeah.
But the culture must allow for that. People must feel safe to put up their hand and say, can we look at that? They must trust the process. There must be policies in place. How do we handle it? Are we more about thinking about our reputation to the outside than the health of our school on the inside? And those things are tough questions for school boards to answer, where they often very quickly legal up, and they want to contain the damage instead of fixing what's wrong on the inside.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about technology. What role does it play in grooming, in prevention, in abuse, and so forth?
I think in the first episode of the documentary series, it was shown beautifully by using WhatsApp voice notes and the WhatsApp messages between a coach and a player. And if we understand that grooming is a continuous conversation, a gradual conversation, building trust, building an intimacy, and how those borders are pushed. And I think it's very easy to say, but coaches and players shouldn't be communicating on their phones. But it's not realistic. It's got to happen. So what if we understand the danger that lies in giving a person access, and knowing that grooming is not always only a physical thing, it can only be done digitally as well. I think that's where parents must be more active, understand what's happening in terms of technology and the various platforms people can have access to their kids, but also for schools again on their side to provide policy to protect teachers and coaches as well, and say, you know what, this is what we think is healthy behavior on your side and professional behavior on your side, and we can defend you on this side, but if you do this, you're on your own.
Yeah. And also because, I mean, in some cases, and whether it's schools or colleges or whatever, they'll remove the perpetrator.
Yes.
And in other cases, then they'll stop WhatsApp interaction whatsoever. That's not sorting out the problem.
No.
Because the perpetrator might not communicate WhatsApp there, but can go to Facebook, can go to another
Find another channel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If a parent suspects and wants to go in and wants to investigate further, what route should they take as a family first to help the victim or the survivor, and also to help themselves, and then in terms of the legal route?
So I think we maybe need to go back a little bit and say that, you know, before you suspect abuse, you need to try and prevent it if you can. And I think as families, you know, often we feel like it's kind of it's beyond us, because, you know, what am I going to do if sophisticated schools and systems can't actually pick up where there's abuse? Well, how would I be able to do it? And I think we need to break it down to very, very simple steps. So the first thing that I would say to families is it's relationship. You need to be talking to your children. You need to be talking to them about everything. But you also need to be talking to them about sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
And you need to be talking to them about boundaries, and you need to be talking to them about touches that make them feel uncomfortable and situations that make them feel uncomfortable. And although we can't always, you know, I would never say if your child has been abused, we should not be taking it as being our fault as families, because often it's very easy to do that. I think there are things that we can do to equip our children. And it comes down to those things that Luke mentioned earlier. So professional boundary violations. Children need to be able to identify that actually, yeah, that it's inappropriate for that coach to be WhatsApping me and speaking to me in that way. That coach is standing too close to me. You know, we've got, there's no necessity for that coach to be showing me by touching me what the move is. Those kinds of things. Being called to a one-on-one meeting with a coach behind closed doors. Well, you know, why can't the other team members be there? It's that kind of thing. If you've got nothing to hide, you hide absolutely nothing. But I also think that from parents' perspectives, often they've got a lot to lose when something like this gets exposed. You know, often the reason that parents send their children to these wonderful schools is because they really hope that it's going to help to set them up for the future. And if they're involved in a sport and they happen to be particularly talented at a sport, you know, a lot of times parents have got a lot invested. And it feels like there are no winners when you go and say, well, you know, this is what's happened with a particular coach, and you know, I don't want this person coaching my child anymore. They might be the one who's going to take your child to Springbok level, but you have to be willing to sacrifice everything. And maybe it's going to feel very hard for your child even, but actually it's so important that you put your priorities in place in terms of your child's safety has to be the most important thing. And then if we look at, in the unfortunate eventuality that something does go wrong, what parents need to do is they need to understand that what we want to do is we want to be able to work with the schools wherever possible. So you need to make your concerns known to the school, not only because that's the first port of call, but also because there could be other children in danger as well. And so what we need to do is we need to look at investigations that take place both at a school level and then holding the school accountable for ensuring that it's reported to SACE, that it's reported to the SAPS, that it's reported to the Department of Social Development so that an investigation can take place.
Just before you carry on, you said reported to SACE. Could you just tell us what that is?
Sorry, that's the South African Council of Educators. So if you are an educator and you're working in a school, you need to be registered with SACE. It's really important that schools make sure that all their educators are registered with SACE, because it isn't necessarily the case. And unfortunately, particularly with coaches, often they fall between the cracks because they're not actually registered teachers. So what schools need to do is they need to make sure that they have a very careful vetting process in place. And I want to say particularly with old boys, because often we have this perception that actually, you know, this child has been at our school before and now they've grown up and now, you know, we know them. And actually you don't necessarily know them. So you still need to do doing your background checks. You still need to make sure that that person doesn't have a criminal record, that they're not on the child protection register to say that they've offended against a child, that they're not on the sexual offences register. And then I also want to say that Google is your friend, because unfortunately, as was mentioned earlier, our systems are not necessarily always effective. And so there are times when people actually are perpetrators, but they're not on any of those, that you wouldn't be able to do a background check. Plus, you're not allowed to as a parent, but you can Google them. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to find out if somebody has actually been a perpetrator in other places, and make sure that you then speak to your school and protect your child.
Yeah, because the reality of that is that a lot of these laws hadn't been passed many years ago, many decades ago. So, you know, these people have gone undetected, and also more importantly, boundaries. Boundaries is something that's been brought into our space, and it's not just about children, it's also about adults as well.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the psychological effects that it has, either long-term or short-term, and anybody can pick up this question on victims and survivors, and why it's so important to seek healing in whatever way you find healing.
Yeah, I think something that was tough for me watching the series is to see where something that I saw was where people did everything they could to heal, and even that wasn't enough. So we must never underestimate the impact this has at certain age, how severe it is. And some people will live with this for the rest of their lives. They will find a way to be happy and healthy, but it affects them. For me, I think in terms of relationships going forward, it's something to understand where your relationship with a partner, your relationship in terms of sexuality, your relationship in terms of intimacy, and how shame plays out in weird ways. And if you have shame, you can't have proper vulnerability. And if you don't have vulnerability, you can't really be an authentic person. So to see how this affects other parts of your life, but primarily your relationships going forward. Even though you survive, even though you are okay, go do some counseling or therapy, go through the process, find some relief and resolve in that. And that's sometimes the biggest gift you can give to your children going forward.
Yeah.
And also there are different ways, some counselling might not work for one, but it could work for another group.
Yes.
So find your path. Robyn, you were going to say
I just wanted to add to that, there's often, and when I tell stories, I come across a lot of victims, and particularly victims' families, who go, okay, we want to move on now. And actually, that is not an effective strategy in terms of the victim. And certainly nobody else can make that choice for them. The idea that we're actually just going to put this behind us, we're never going to speak about it again. Institutions do that as well.
Yeah.
Schools do that. We've got rid of the perpetrator, we're just going to carry on with our lives.
It didn't happen, yeah.
But actually, no, because that perpetrator and that abuse stays with that victim. And they need to determine the pace and the process themselves. They need to decide, when do I feel like actually I can move on with parts of my life? That needs to be something that they decide. And we can't as families impose that. And we certainly can't as schools impose that. So now, particularly the Parktown Boys case was an example of that, where the school went, okay, well, Colin Rex is now in prison, and so now you guys must be fine. And yet, meanwhile, they were re-victimized all the time because they were never able to get past the idea that they had been his victims. So I think that's really important that we look at that and that we make sure that the healing process is something that we are very intentional about, because otherwise, unfortunately, what we see long term is the abuse of alcohol.
Yeah, it's a cycle. It's another form of
exactly,
cycle.
or suicidal intent. Huge pathology in terms of people's own lives, and very self-destructive behaviors, because they can never outrun that moment of
constantly
victimhood.
chasing. Anything you want to add to that, Nicole?
Absolutely. It's certainly, the people around the survivor may, as you said, want to move on, but it's more an element of, you're never going to leave that in the past and move on. You are now moving forward with that as part of, sadly, it is now part of your identity. Part of the survivor's identity, it's part of the family's identity. It's something that happened to all of you. And it has changed all of you in various ways. So there is no moving on, there's only moving forward.
Absolutely.
With the tools, with the grief. Grief is going to be part of that, grieving the family you thought you were, the parents you thought you were, if you hold some, unassigned guilt around that, all of those things. And very interestingly, what I wanted to comment on regarding some of the after effects that survivors may see, what I've seen for myself in people I've spoken with, especially young men who were sort of 15 and upwards, during puberty, and perhaps sexually active themselves in other ways, and then were also targeted by a female predator. Those young men tend to present, as I've seen, quite differently with their trauma in life, and often that only hits them in their late 30s and 40s. And they start to realize, looking back, how this has impacted all of their relationships. How there's addictive behavior involved, whether it's relating to sex or porn or drugs or eating or shopping or gambling, however that presents. They start to realize that back then I may not have realized, I may have even thought I was lucky, which is this horrible narrative we hear around those types of situations. Now I realize I was not emotionally ready for that relationship with it's not a relationship, but with that predatory relationship with an older person, and that did damage me in ways I didn't recognize.
Yeah. And in closing, I think the most important thing which Robyn, you highlighted on, is that the healing process isn't linear. And so whether you see yourself as a victim or survivor, there's no right or wrong way. But take the step if you can in terms of the healing journey. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but I thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching, and of course the conversation doesn't end here. As we've mentioned in this interview, is that perpetrators are not those dark figures in the alleys, are not the people from the wrong side of town. We know them. That's not hearsay. But it's now we're at the point where we need that communication, we need these open conversations, and we also need to forgive ourselves. The healing journey is not linear. For those of you who haven't been watching the series, it's okay. You can catch it on Catch Up. And if you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them on the platform. And of course, all of my guests for today, their contact details will be there. Thanks so much. This is Mnet School Ties Podcast.